And I would like first to deeply thank the organizer, David, Ned, and Nico and Matthew for this invitation. As my colleagues are, we are very happy to be here and to share with you. We have only one frustration. Each of us would like to speak 2 days for the 2 days. So I would like to avoid this problem. So I will go back when I was confronted with this very fascinating issue of the workshop today. And Ned and David told me that most of you are not very familiar with neurology. I hope it is the case, otherwise it's going to be boring for you. But I thought that maybe one of possible interesting issues that we could address together in order to try to avoid, let's say, a nominalism or idealistic categories would be to show you how it works in clinical neurology with these patients, because it's the first level on which we will build everything else in order to address these consciousness issues. And I think it is important because, as I will try to show you, clinical neurology is absolutely fabulous. It's very interesting. That's the reason why there are some neurologists. But it also has a lot of limitations. And I think that we have to speak and to be aware of these limitations in order to better understand the problems we have to solve and we have to face. And it's not only because it's interesting to raise issues, but one of the important reasons why I thought it could be interesting to discuss that with you today, and I hope you are already trained to my French accent for remaining part. Usually the first minute or so is necessary to do so. So I try not to say very important things, but still to capture your attention. So it's the PCI here is necessary too. But no, more seriously, the reason why I think it's interesting to advocate this issue is we are facing, I'm not very empathic, emphatic, generally speaking, but I think really there is a new era, and the new era is that we can begin to address the limits of clinical neurology by all these tools we are discussing together, and we have magnificent talks this morning and just right now about the new objects. And I would like just to go back to the clinical neurology to help you to understand what are the priors and the limitation of it, and because also it's very important both for medical issues, ethical issues that we will discuss at length, of course, and also for scientific and philosophical issues too, because of course these extreme conditions such as the dog patient disorders, patient with disorders of consciousness, first, in addition to the medical and ethical issues, they act like thought experiments, like how would it be? Would you like to call this state conscious or not? In such states in which you could have some splitting or dissociation between cognitive functions or cognitive processes, which usually go together. So it's very important to challenge the current models and the current theories, and also to refine the terms. It may be well that one day maybe we will agree, Ned and I, about consciousness, and so maybe these patients also can help us to refine the term like a dialectic cycle between here are our categories, we test them, and we understand that there's something to change. So for all these reasons, I think it's interesting to go back to the first level, which is clinical neurology. I'm sorry for the slides, there is an issue with the ratio, but so how clinical neurology works, it's what you should read. And what I mean, it's very trivial what I'm going to say, but sometimes trivial things can be useful, nevertheless. When you go to see a neurologist, the neurologist will use two approaches. He will combine two approaches. And the first of these two approaches, we can label it the psychological approach. And basically, it corresponds to collect very meticulously with a lot of attention and also knowledge to collect your subjective report. So when someone has to consult a neurologist, or when you think that someone should consult a neurologist, the first stage would be to collect the subjective report. And what I'm saying is not about disorder of consciousness patients. I'm meaning if you have a pain somewhere, you will first speak and report what you subjectively experience as a conscious sensation being a pain. If you have an episodic memory impairment, first, we want to know what is your subjective report about this problem. The same for motor disorders, for language disorders. So you have all the positive aspects of subjective reports. So subjective reports are really important for a neurologist. And they are important not only when they are positive, but also when you think that the disorder primarily comes from the subjective level, like hallucinations, in which there is no peripheral stimulus, for instance, which then give rise to strange contents, hallucinations or delusions or false memories. So you see the subjective reports for us, for clinical neurologists, it's really important. We cannot work basically without subjective reports. And the last illustration to convince you about that, also have conditions in neurology in which the negative aspects of subjective reports are the major problem. So when you have a patient with a left hemiplegia, and you observe that he is lacking such subjective reports are reporting you that his part of body is completely paralyzed, it's also a problem of subjective reports. So you see, we really need this first pillar of neurology to solve questions. But of course, the second part is if you only had to subjective reports to collect subjective reports, you could go to a psychologist or to a shrink. Maybe you could be even more efficient to do that. But we have to combine these subjective reports with something, and that is something I want to tell a few more words about it, which we could call the behavioral neurology, behavioral approach. And this behavioral approach is grounded on a very long-lasting and rich and detailed and with a lot of priors about what we call the anatomico-clinical method of neurology. And for popularly, neurologists are people with hammers and reflexes. It's true, it's part of the behavioral neurology. But usually, when we work the best, it's with the two options. But sometimes, neurology becomes what I could call one-legged. It is to say that you just can't work with a psychological approach. And this is the case for, sorry for the slide, for non-communicating patients, in whom obviously you have a problem to collect and to know if there is something like subjective reports. And in confronted to such a condition, a situation, first when you frame these issues this way, you understand first that when we interact with non-communicating patients, such as VS, MCS patients, it has been described very well, first there is a problem. Because anything we will say about consciousness, which is a subjective experience, will be indirect. We will have no direct access to psychology. So you see the fragility of our approach, but still, there is also another issue, and that's the reason of the enigmatic aspect of my title. In everyday life practice, and I will develop that more, this confusion between behavior and psychology is at the origin of a lot of misunderstandings. What I mean by quiproquo, I know there are two usages in English, so I prefer maybe misunderstandings for quiproquo. Meaning that when you say that patients are minimally conscious, and we heard that and we discussed that also, of course a family or a relative or even colleagues listening to minimally conscious, they will keep conscious and they will project on consciousness, which is already a polysemic word in normal subjective people in whom everyone agrees that they are conscious. Still, we are not agree. So in this case, it's giving rise to a lot of issues, and it's not just intellectual discussions. It can be very painful, and also when we discuss with social society. And so I will go back, and so we have to solve this now, not like the American way. We have to do it, but I mean, we have we have ways to address these issues like we never had before. And in this case, I think we are living since 1 decade or two in a very interesting era for this special reason. So let's go back first, and that's my the core part, let's say, would be that. We have an heritage, and so we have to know our heritage, and it's clinical neurology. And basically, I'm French, but we could say very fairly that the main hero of this tradition is rather a British neurologist, Hugh Jackson. And I will try just to go back on a few claims of Hugh Jackson. And basically, you will see that Jackson introduced a very important concept of conceiving the central nervous system as a hierarchical, integrated, and vertical structure. And I will show you an illustration of that in a second. And basically, what we will collect from that is first a method to examine patients, but also it's a very strong explicit and implicit prior, meaning that consciousness has to deal with cortical activity. And I will go back to Ned's issue about the question that you mentioned in a moment. So here is Hugh Jackson, for those of you who never seen him. If you have to read one thing, it's the Krunian lectures, which are it's a very powerful, insightful text. And just to convince you, I don't know if you are very familiar, maybe more familiar than I am even with Jackson, but just to provide you one illustration of the usefulness of Jackson. You know that before Jackson, here you have a representation of the motor pathway, okay? For the primary motor cortex, the Rolandic structure with the first motor neuron, which is then projecting into the brainstem, decussation in the medulla, and then synapsing on the second motor neuron, which will innervate the muscles. Okay, you have the two neurons. When there is a lesion somewhere here, for instance, everyone knew before Jackson that the patient will behave with negative symptoms. He will lose something. He will lose a function of these specific structures. But when you are a neurologist, you do not stop to negative signs, and you can see, for instance, that we know that also, although unilateral movements, voluntary movement are lost, you still observe some movements. And it's not only that some movements are retained, but most of the time they are increased, and you observe abnormal reactions, reflexes which were not present without the lesion. So in a word, you have positive symptoms. And we can fairly say that before Jackson, no one could provide an account, a satisfactory account of why a lesion somewhere would provoke positive symptoms in addition to the negative ones, okay? And of course, the positive symptoms are not very useful to the patient, but they're here. Like, for instance, still I'm French, so here is the most famous of it. Maybe you heard about the Babinski sign. So when you have you make a cutaneoplantar stimulation, usually you do not observe this behavior, which is a spinal cord reflex, in which you can have this slow and majestuous extension of the big toe and the fanning of the toe. So here's one evidence of the positive symptoms. And how did Ewing-Jackson solve this issue? He proposed this model. The model basically is that you have the spinal cord, you have the brainstem, you have the diencephalon up to the cortex. And the notion is that the higher you are in this vertical structure, the more power you have on inferior structures. And so that is to say that not only are you piloting the behavior with your own function, but you also control inferior structures. So when you have a lesion somewhere, you lose the function of this region, but also you lose the inhibition of inferior structures, which can then reveal some behaviors you could not observe before, okay? And in the view of Jackson, he also postulated that there was a gradient, as if the higher you are in this vertical axis, the more fragile you are to aggressions, in the words of Jackson. So Jackson was not living alone in his office. He was living in the British Victorian Society. So I found this picture, which is fairly good, I mean, to reproduce the spirit of the mind. We are far away from a participatory democracy. And so you have the British beehive, in which you have the queen and the family queen, which are at the top, and they have the power, but they are fragile. And you can go down to each level, to the workers, and etc. So you have the Spencer influence, etc. But still, we have to know that when you examine a patient in a comatose state, so one-leg neurology is the most like brain days, but comatose patient, it's more important because usually you don't have that many dots for brain days. But with a comatose patient, it's true that actually the conception of Jackson works pretty well. It's very rare, for instance, that you can observe the abolition, so the absence of an inferior reflex and the preservation of upper reflex. So this gradient is absolutely useful. And in the continuation of this heritage, we have, of course, we are in New York, Plum et Posner, and the continuation with Nico, the new edition of it, which is the new version of this heritage. And it's going not down or up as you want, it's going to, at least, to our current scales to observe consciousness. So I just cite in the one of Joe Giacino's seminal paper on this minimally conscious state, which is integrating all of us so much. I read it from here, it's better. In MCS, cognitively mediated behavior occurs, and they can be differentiated from reflexive behavior. If you take this term seriously, you see that we are still in the very same influence, meaning that when you are in a patient with the one-leg neurology, the only thing you can do is to probe the functioning of this vertical system with your category in mind. Meaning that if you can see some evidence of cortical processing, and we are back to Ned's issue, is cortical processing enough to say that you have consciousness because it's indirect and it's completely free of the subjective reports? And let's have, just to go in the same direction, the CRS scale, which is, so far, we could say that today is the gold standard, it's the pure neo-Jacksonian scale, and which is very useful for us in the daily practice. And so for each function, we can score the patients, and on the basis of these scores, you can categorize. When you have a small star, it means that if you observe such a behavior, you cannot speak of vegetative state. So let's take just one illustration. If you have one eye fixation, so the ability to fixate on a stimulus for a few seconds, or if even you have a visual pursuit, it is one of the most important signs of this scale. That is to say, if the patient is able to follow a mirror placed in front of his eyes, then you would discard vegetative state. You would say, no, it cannot be. And why would you do that? Again, you don't have any issue, any idea about the subjective experience of the patient. But what are you doing that? Because according to Jackson, not according to Jackson, but visual pursuit requires the functioning of frontal eye field or other cortical structure. So when you observe visual pursuit in a patient, it means that you have cortical processing which is efficient enough to translate into behavior and to be different than a reflex mediated in the brainstem, for instance. Why did I take so much time to tell you that? Just to make you feel that we try to translate from behavior to psychology, but of course it's very fragile because, again, it's one-leg neurology. So at this stage, you could say, okay, yeah, the confusions. So just the last experience I had, I had some discussions, and you can see this Joe McJourner and two British social scientists who are working a very interesting work on the way, according to the media framing of cognitive neuroscience discoveries in patients, how does it impact families, relatives, and the meaning related to these terms, such as minimally conscious or vegetative. And so, of course, you see that we have a great confusion according to the polysemy and to the meaning related to each of these words. And still, according to me, you could say, okay, so if it's too problematic, let's avoid of speaking minimally conscious, let's say minimally behaving or something like that. No, I think it's very important because the important issue for the patient, it's not the Babanski sign, it's the consciousness. So we have to deal with that, not to escape or to avoid this question, but to explain that we assess it with uncertainty, with ambiguity, and that we have to improve. So just a last digression to it's a work that is not yet published, it's in preparation with Frédéric Faugeras, one of my students, just to tell you that one-leg neurology is not that bad. Because you could say, many people think, okay, being VS or MCS, it's not a big deal. It's not make a huge difference. Actually, it makes a huge difference. If you make a survey analysis with 34 VS patients in black and MCS patients in red, you can see tremendous differences in terms of prognosis, of survival, just according to these subtle behaviors that we have to find. So, of course, it makes a difference, and we have to improve that. So, and the last point before turning to the second part of my talk is that that's the climax of my intervention, of my presentation. So, okay, it's one-leg neurology, it's indirect, it's fragile, but also some of the priors are simply incorrect. What I mean by that, we could say in one sentence that, okay, the neo-Jacksonian view is that, okay, subcortical behaviors are not conscious. So when you find evidence of subcortical functioning, you can discard consciousness. I mean, it's not a sign of consciousness. But this statement doesn't say that when you observe cortical processing, it is consciousness. But you have to admit that most of our colleagues, and the way I was trained during my studies, I'm not that young, but not that old neither, we have this idea that if you find the cortical processing, yes, of course, you are very close to consciousness. You know what? It's the same thing. But actually, you know, and it's back again to Ned's question. Just to take one slide, we could speak hours of that, but during the last decade, we and many other labs could show that actually any piece of cortex not only can process information in the absence of subjective report, using subliminal stimuli or, as you said, flash suppression or other paradigms, but it's not only that you could describe that in terms of cortical processing, but you can even find that the kind of representation which seem to be at work could be from perceptual to semantic, emotional, motor, some aspects of control. So it means that actually not only cortical processing is not a direct evidence of consciousness, but even complex cortical processing is not an evidence. Okay? So what can we do? And this is my last digression. I think that we can use cognitive neuroscience, all the tools that are discussed here, in order to so we will help patients, but before we have to help neurologists and to have to restore a bipedal neurology, that is to say, to reintroduce psychology by the means of cognitive neuroscience, so to allow again the practice of a neurology using the two approaches, which are the most important ones. And just a short digression, sorry. I checked the pronunciation before, but so a short digression. You know, maybe it's not the case for you, but I am, but I think we are collectively very sensitive to one point, is that, you know, when you are a patient, a human being in a fragile condition, etc., and when you consider that we will take the subject and we will plug electrodes on his wires, we will put him in magnet, in electromagnetic fields, We will quantify brain activity such as Marcello and Melanie showed you before. We will then make complex matrices about all that. You can have the immediate intuition that we are contributing to transforming the subject into an object, like with technoscience, losing the subjectivity. But my claim would be that it is completely the opposite. That far from participating to transforming the subject into an object, all our efforts here aim to strengthening subjectivity by accessing it beyond behavior. And the whole issue is this point. So in a way, we could claim that we are a neo-humanistic people. I mean, we don't, it's the completely opposite of the immediate intuition of what people think we are doing. Okay. So what can we do? And this part I will be much faster, due also to all our colleagues before. The current approaches, I see them at 3 major goals. I mean, and we could classify most of the work we are doing, all of us, in the 3 directions. First, you can try to find some neural correlates or neural signatures of conscious states, donc specific of conscious states, but irrespective of the cognitive processes at work, irrespective of the tasks you are asking the subject to perform, irrespective of the cognitive processes at work. So just, let's say, the conscious states intransitively of what is the content and what are the processes. And of course, you have like wonderful illustration by the works on PET scan, for instance, the one that Stephen presented us. Of course, the resting state literature can be classified in this field, like the one Melanie showed us. I think this will win the most integrated version. I mean, your slide is in all Marcello, in all presentations. So because it's a major issue also. So again, Marcello is using a way to probe neural activity irrespective of the state, of the conscious content, but to specifically tap on a state. Then, so in this field, we have I'm very sorry for the slide, but as it was said also by David, with Stanislas Dehaene, Jean-Pierre Changeux, in continuation of Bernard Barth's formulation of the global workspace, you try to propose a theory. I would say that it is sharing some concept, in particular the differentiation integration is very important, and I think the information theory is providing important issues to the, but maybe this one is more related to neural underpinnings of this phenomenon. But just basically one illustration. Recently, with Jean-Rémy King and Jacob Ossit, 2 very young and very brilliant PhD and postdoc researchers, we designed a new method. Actually, Jacobo, who is a physicist, used a new method to compute connectivity across electrodes in the EEG. It's called the weight symbolic mutual information. I would like to explain you, so maybe you have a question because I will not explain it now. You can save the question. But basically, on this kind of punk hair, you can see that each hair is the index of functional connectivity between 2 electrodes, so between 2 pieces of cortex. And what you can see that when it's reddish, like here, it's for the healthy conscious subject. And then you can move to the conscious, but conscious patients in a bed, and they are not in good shape necessarily, minimally conscious, and VS. And it's not only a visual impression, but what was nice is that for us in clinics, as you understood, the difficult issue is that, to distinguish between these 2. And we have like a sudden fall of the functional connectivity between MCS and VS. And when you compute the mean connectivity of each electrode with all the others, you have this kind of pattern. So here is the anterior part of the head, the posterior, and the holes here are for the ears, because you could have questions and you don't understand the slide. So it's the net that which we are superimposing on the head. So you can see that in conscious controls, the hub of connectivity, we could expect frontal cortex, but it was parietal cortex, actually, which was, as you can see here. And we can still find this hub of connectivity in conscious patients. You can even see it on the group of minimally conscious, but again, it seems that there is a dramatic chance for the vegetative state patient, again, a loss of integration of this long-range communication. And of course, it's interesting because, as it was said also by Melanie, but this resting state conscious network, let's say, is also associated in terms of psychological content with mental projection in time, past, future, in space, navigation, in mind, theory of mind, etc., etc. So maybe it's a closer link with psychology. And the second illustration I would like to give about that, again with the same duo of Jacob Ossit, but it's not King and Sit, it's Sit and King this time for the paper. And so it's the way we record, as all of us do, EEG at bedside. And we could derive 92 measures of the EEG, which were deriving from the conceptual framework that we have in mind. I will not develop, but for each of them, from spectral measures, connectivity, complexity, we could test for individual measure how well it could discriminate between the patients. But the most interesting thing is that when we could combine all the measures together, the 92 measures, here what we found. Again, what is difficult for us is a VS patient. We don't want, as Nico said, the contradiction. We don't want to find evidence which would, or if we find, we contradict and we discard the diagnosis. The patient is not VS anymore, in a way. That's an issue we have to discuss. But so here we had in this study 75 patients for whom the clinical, so the behavioral diagnosis of this one-leg neurology was vegetative state, the best we could do, and they were vegetative for us. But we trained an EEG an algorithm with all this EEG data. We trained the EEG to provide us with a diagnosis, but only based on the EEG. Again, it's a method in which you provide all the data but one patient. You train the algorithm with the good labels of the patient, and then in this hyperspace of 92 dimensions, he finds the hyperplane which is taking into account the data, and then you test the new patient for whom he could not test the model before. And as you can see, most of the VS, the behavioral VS, were all EEG VS, okay. But we had this major difference. 1/3 of the patients were considered as MCS by this algorithm, so you could say it's a noise, it's a limitation of the measure, but the only information, supplementary information we have is that we follow these patients, and actually, the recovery of consciousness, so being, let's be clear, what I call here recovery of consciousness is going from VS to MCS, okay? But going to VS to MCS in 6 weeks, you double the proportion, and it's significant, when the EEG had the categorization of the patient being MCS. So meaning that maybe we can collect also from our data additional evidence to enrich the way we work. And I would like David to know how much time do I have?
Maybe about a few minutes.
A few minutes. Thank you. Few, it's open. So I see the. Oh no. I lost already one so far. So no. So the second. So first, brain states. Second one is you can try to image this time not a state, but a task, a cognitive task, for which you think this task requires being conscious to be able to perform it. Okay, which is another. And each of these three methods has a pro and the con. The pro here is that you really tap on one cognitive processing that you can describe, but the con is that you don't really know. It can be negative for many reasons, and the patient can be conscious, as we said. But still here, you have, of course, all the Owen and Stephen and Nico Schiff, both in fMRI, the mental navigation, but also in EEG with the Goldfine paper, for instance, trying to map cognitive tasks which require consciousness. So just a very short digression, just to say that another layer of subtlety. You can have tasks, cognitive tasks, actually, which you cannot report. You cannot report them. So if we ask normal controls, conscious controls about this task, we can see they can perform the tasks, but they are not able to be neither the agent of the task, nor being able to report it. But still, these tasks, some of them, require you to be conscious of the stimulus. You have that in dynamic regulation of control, but in many aspects, in cognitive dissonance resolution, we could show that you have to be aware of the information to let the process go, but you are not aware of the process, you are not agent of it. So to say, here again, that's another layer. You can observe a task which requires consciousness, but actually what you are imaging is not conscious processing. But you see the point? I hope. And the last point, I will close with that. You could try, and that's the one we selected during the last years, you try to image a very specific event which is consensual for consciousness. It's not consensual in terms of is it represented, including all what we want to call conscious, but conscious access, so the ability to subjectively report to yourself, not a behavior, but report to yourself on information, can you try to image it? And so just a very recent work with Benjamin Rowe, if you present subject normal controls with pairs of words, hive and bee, so there is a semantic link, sled and snow. And if you invert, so to make incongruent, so absence of semantic link, like hive, snow, and sled bee, in the end, you compute the EAPs of the very same words, just the semantic relation is different. And we know since Marta Kutas works in the 80s, that when you do that, you can observe two responses in the brain according to this violation of semantic regularity. Let's put it this way. First, a negativity, called the N400, and a late positive response, called the late positive complex, which is later on. And what we could find with Benjamin, it's just been accepted in neuropsychology, that in controls you find the first event, the N400, the one I showed you, but you can observe the N400 at the group level, both in VS and MCS. So it's kind of evidence of semantic processing in VS patients. And you do not need to be conscious to do that because we know that in controls, with subliminal words, you can elicit N400. But the second event, the late positive complex, in our study was observed only in the MCS group, not in the VS group. And with Simon van Gaal from Amsterdam, we could demonstrate that in controls, subliminal violation of regularity do elicit N400, but not the late positive complex. So as if we could have here a marker of conscious semantic processing and non-conscious semantic processing. And the last point, if I stimulate you with sounds, beep, 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 and I just ask you to pay attention to the sounds, we know since the 60s that you can collect, again, two events. An early event, which is a mismatch negativity, which does not require consciousness. If you observe it in the comatose, it has a good prognosis of consciousness recovery. And then a later one, which is like the late positive complex. It's called the P300. So there is a very nice parallel between the two things. And with Tristan Bekenstein, so I will not develop the whole paradigm now, but we, sorry, but I don't know what happened. Yes, okay. With Tristan Bekenstein, we could, in a word, make a paradigm to dissociate the two responses, to isolate the mismatch negative on one contrast and to isolate the P300 on the another contrast, so to be sure that we could disentangle between these two responses. And we could show basically that in normal controls, you can see the mismatch negativity even if you are not conscious of the regularity which is delivered to you, and that, in opposite, the late response is observed only if you are able to report in the end of the experiment the structure of the sounds which were used in this experiment. So for instance, I give you just one illustration. If I stimulate you with this kind of block, so you hear trials, each trial has 5 sounds. Beep, 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 okay? So imagine a block like this one. The rule now of the block is that the 5th sound has to be different than the first 4. So you would hear something like that. Beep, 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 like 20 or 30 trials. If you, our hypothesis was, if you are conscious, if you have working memory, so it makes a lot of if, which has to be multiplied in terms of probability together, but if you understand the rule, blah, blah, then if I stimulate you with a very banal stimulus like beep, 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 which does not convey any novelty, but if you have in mind that you are expecting something completely different, this time this banal stimulus will elicit a novelty response. And this way, we could isolate the P3 from the N400, from the mismatch negativity, sorry, and show that this response is not localized in primary areas like auditory cortex, but in this frontoparietal cortex, which has been described before. And the last thing I want to show you is that we could, with Imen El-Karoui, show with intracranial recordings like the one on Marcello with epileptic patients, shows that there is a very striking parallel, both in ERPs, spectral properties, functional connectivity, between the auditory and visual conscious access measures, as if you would tap on a command mechanism to conscious access irrespective of the content. But it's, of course, just an hypothesis. We have to test it more. And I will close just by saying, so we are using this measure in the patients. And basically, it's a very specific measure. If I have a patient showing this measure, we discard the VS diagnosis. I would even put it stronger than Nico, that if you have one of these tests, which is solid, is positive, you can discard. It's not like there is a contradiction in the term, so it's not vegetative state. But it's very loosely sensitive, so it misses a lot of patients. You know they are conscious without just with the behavior or with even subjective reports. And I will close just with the eyes, local global for your eyes only. So with Marion Quirins, we could show recently that in normal controls, so it's very nice work Stephen presented with the pupils. You have pupil dilation for mental effort, for conscious mental effort, and whereas the local effect does not impact your pupil dilation, the global effect does. And nicely, it's from yesterday, so Marion just sent me that yesterday. When you take normal controls in whom you don't say any instruction of the task, you observe the global effect in the pupil dilation, so the pupil dilation for violation of regularity, only in those subjects who can report the notion of global regularity at the end of the experiment, and the one which couldn't do not show it. So as if it could be another marker of conscious access, but of course, so restoring a bipedal neurology reintroduces the psychological approach and trying to think about this long-lasting neurological quiproquo which conveys positive and negative information. And of course, as Marcello, it's a huge team, and there is just a photography of Frédéric Faugeras that I could not find this morning, so I thank you for attention. I hope I was not too long. Thank you very much. Thank you.